and
Okay.
we can get started. So Rona, what we've done, is it Rona or Rana?
It's Ron.
Rana, okay.
Uh-huh.
What we've done is, I say we jump around a lot, and we do from week to week, but we have spent several weeks talking about the Civil War. I mean, one thing I read said the Civil War back in the 1860s is the central event of American history, and it really is. I mean, you don't have to look very deep into our news today to see
Yeah.
we're still dealing with the effects of 400 years of slavery.
Yep.
Right.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so so we have spent a couple of weeks. We looked at what the lead up to the Civil War, and it took you can trace the roots of the Civil War back to the 1820s. 40 years before the war started. There's events that are we can now look backwards and say that was leading up to this conflict. And so the 1820s, 1840s, 1850s. We talked about bleeding Kansas in the 1850s and that conflict. Um, which the story there is, as we didn't always have these 50 states, right? So as the states, as the country of America expanded westward from the original 13 colonies, 13 states, it first it was the land out there was territory, and then the territories became states. Well, as the territories became states, there was a question: is it going to be a state with slavery or without slavery? Was it going to be a slave state or what they called a free state? Well, back then they had a lot of tough times answering that question. So there was a lot of conflict as each state out west became a state. The people in the South that had slavery wanted to make that new state a slave state. The people in the North that didn't have slavery wanted it to be a free state without slavery. So then it comes to a boiling point in 1861, um, and so the Civil War breaks out. So we spent a couple of weeks talking about the Civil War on a big scale, not really too specific. And then the period so then that comes to today. The period after the Civil War, 1865, the Civil War ends. The period after the Civil War is called the Reconstruction period because, and I think this is endlessly fascinating, you just fought a war with the North and the South. Okay, I don't have my map here ready of the Civil War, but that North and South, they fought a war, and most of the fighting was in the South. Most of the battles were in the South, so the South was very beaten up, right?
Mm-hmm.
They lost a lot, thousands, hundreds of thousands of men from the North and South died. 600, we generally say 620,000 overall. Now we say Americans, North and South. 620,000 men, mostly men, died in the Civil War. Many more went home injured, right? Shot in the eye, having their leg amputated and stuff. Um, and then, of course, you have the losing side. The South lost the Civil War, so slavery ends. We'll touch on that a little bit. Um, and President Abraham Lincoln welcomes them back. He could have held a grudge, and lots of people in the North did hold a grudge and said, those people caused 4 years of war, 4 years of anguish. My husband died, my son died because of fighting with the South. You could have wanted to punish, lots of people did want to punish the people from the South. But Abraham Lincoln, in his wisdom as president, said, if we punish them, we don't have a country, right? We have to move forward. We have to look forward, move forward. Yes, he certainly understood the desire to punish the South, but he said if we punish them, that's no good. We have to welcome them back and basically pretend like, I mean, almost pretend like it never happened, because the alternative is just more conflict, more hate, and then you don't solve anything, right? You don't move on. Unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated a week after the surrender that ended the Civil War. So we'll never know how it would have played out. Okay. So when the president, as we know from the Constitution, when the president is killed in office, the vice president is bumped up, right? So his vice president, who was kind of not that big of a deal, Andrew Johnson, um, becomes vice president or becomes president when he's assassinated. Um, and so then what happens? So he's president for a little while, not very long, couple of years, a year or two, I think, because when the president is assassinated, the vice president becomes president, but only finishes that 4-year term, right? They don't start their own new 4 years. They finish that president, the previous president's 4 years. So he was president for a little while, didn't do a very good job, but the country was okay. Then I forget which election. The big Union general from the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant, um, became president. So he's a war hero on the northern side, the winning side. He was the big top general at the end of the Civil War. Um, Big hero. He's elected president. And I think we would say he did a good job. Now, in the past, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Reconstruction. Now, if you think about that, it was a time where slavery was ended. Okay, that's a good thing, but it's an incredibly complex problem to solve, right? So you're a slave. You wake up today and somebody tells you that slavery is over. What are you going to do? You know, families have been torn apart. You it's been illegal for you to learn how to read or write. Lots of slaves did learn to read or write, but like most didn't. It was illegal for you to be uh, to be literate. Um, and so, what are you going to do? You need to get a job, right? You need to find your family, get your family,
Mhm.
get a job, be a part of society. But like the whites in the South, not all whites in the South. In fact, I'm listening to an audiobook this morning when I went for a run, and I listened to a lot of history books, and it reminded me it's this is how big of a history dork I am. I'm listening to a history. I just started it this morning, a history of slave owning white women in the South. I don't know that it's going to be that interesting of a book, but it did remind me that the majority of whites in the South didn't own slaves.
What was the
Okay.
name of the book?
It's the name of the book is They Were Her Property.
Huh.
They Were Her Property. It's not I don't think it's a super long book, but it's a
Right.
history of slave owning white women in the South.
Huh.
So um, I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know that it's going to be super exciting, but I think I'm interested in the topic. We'll see. We'll see how far I make it in before I quit. Um, but it did remind me this morning. I read I listened to the audiobook, the introduction. So it gave like a lot of facts and figures about history, and it said the majority of whites weren't slave owners. Right? There were plenty of poor white people in the South. Well, poor white people aren't going to own slaves. There's plenty of there really wasn't a middle class like we would think of middle class today, but there's plenty of kind of middle of the road, not rich, not poor people, white people in the South that most of them didn't own slaves. Maybe they did, but they owned one or two or three. Those big plantations with 100 slaves, 200 slaves working, hundreds of acres on a giant plantation. That was that's what we see in the movies and that's what we think about in the history books. But that was a small fraction of white people in the South. Those super rich, I mean, that would be like the super rich people today would own 100 slaves and work a big farm, big plantation. Most white people didn't own slaves, but even so, there's still white people in the South, right? So plenty of good people, but there's also plenty of bad people there too. So if you're a slave suddenly set free in the South in 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed, the Civil War's over. You've it's good, it's great. You're not a slave anymore, but there's a lot of hurdles you need to overcome. So people did. So the government stepped in and created what they called the Freedmen's Bureau, because those freed slaves, all former slaves, were called freedmen. So the Freedmen's Bureau was like this big government department with a pretty decent budget, pretty capable government department in like federal, we're talking Washington D.C. level federal department, aimed at helping those former slaves, building schools, getting people educated, getting people jobs, getting land redistributed and sold to people so they can start making a living. Hold on, my alarm's going off. Hold on, hold on 1 second. Okay, I don't know what that was about. So the Freedmen's Bureau was a good thing. It was up and running and getting people going, again, building schools, getting people jobs, and getting life going for these former slaves. Now, what we're going to talk about today, the other part of Reconstruction, as we talked about a few weeks ago when we talked about it, I looked at the beginning of March, we talked about Reconstruction, was that a lot of, not so much former slaves, but previously already freed Black men, 2,000 of them were elected or appointed to federal government jobs, including, I think, about a dozen representatives to the House of Representatives were elected by Southern states. And I think there was, 2 senators, if I recall correctly. That's a big deal. That means that white people are electing Black people in the South. That's huge, in 1860, whatever, 1870, whatever. So Black people go from slavery to senator in, almost overnight. Okay. That's huge progress very, very quickly. And sometimes when you make real fast progress, people don't like it. Some people don't like it. So what we're going to talk about today is the end of Reconstruction. Why did it end? Reconstruction, we talk about, is always listed in history books 1865, because that's the end of the Civil War, to 1877. Well, what happened in 1877 that we call it the end of the Reconstruction period? What we're going to talk about today is it was an election. The election of 1876. The election happens in the fall, and just like we saw this year with Joe Biden, the president is inaugurated in the spring and, the following couple of months. So there was an election of 1876 as we look into the reading now, and the outcome of that election, there was a compromise between the northern states and the southern states, and that resulted somehow, as we're going to see, in what we now consider the end of the Reconstruction period. All that progress, all those people, the Black people that were elected to positions and appointed to government positions, I guess they were still there, but a lot of that social progress just gets swept away. So let's take a look at that. Okay. So the overview, a couple of points we're going to look at today. The Compromise of 1877 resolved the disputed 1876 presidential election between Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden and Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes. Oh, Jendai, I see you logged in. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's okay. Good morning. I've been just yammering on here, and we're just now getting started on the reading. So you're okay.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. Democrats agreed that Rutherford B. Hayes would become president in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South and the granting of home rule in the South. So that's the compromise. And this is kind of, spoiler alert, this is what we're going to talk about. That's the Compromise of 1877. We're going to take a closer look at that.
Mhm.
And President Hayes's withdrawal of federal troops from Louisiana and South Carolina marked a major turning point in American political history, effectively ending the Reconstruction period or Reconstruction era and issuing in the system of Jim Crow. Okay, we'll talk about what Jim Crow is. So that's what we're going to look at. Because of a presidential election, a contested, a disputed presidential election, there was some confusion as to who won. Well, there was a compromise, and the South said, okay, we will let Rutherford B. Hayes win if he then agrees to remove the federal troops, the Union troops from the South. Okay, so we'll talk, that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, so if you have questions, we're going to answer them all.
Okay.
Okay, so the first part is a contested presidential election. It says the Compromise of 1877 resolved the tumult, the chaos, the tumult that had arisen following the 1876 presidential election. In that election, Democratic candidate Samuel J. Tilden of New York won 247,448 more popular votes than Republican Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. But the electoral votes in the three southern states of Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina were disputed. For almost 4 months, from November until late February, tensions remained high as the question of who was to become the nation's next president remained unresolved. Okay, so we all need to remind ourselves real quick, we don't need to understand every little itty bitty detail, but let's remind ourselves of the Electoral College, because that's how people are elected president, right? We go and we vote on November whatever, just like they did in 1876. The people across the country voted. Now, by people, I mean men, and by men, I mean white men, and well, by that point, black men too. But so women still not voting, but you know, they voted across the country. Now, the Electoral College, remember, means that every state within your state, within Pennsylvania, we go and we vote. And then whoever wins the state of Pennsylvania, your vote, my vote, everybody's vote in Pennsylvania, the winner of Pennsylvania gets all of Pennsylvania's Electoral College votes. It's almost like points. I mean, really, we should call them points. Every state has a different number of Electoral College votes. Yeah, since we're talking about the Electoral College, let's pull up. See some images here. The Electoral College, here's a good one. Okay, every state has a different number of Electoral College votes, right? It's our every state has 2 senators plus that state's number of representatives in the House of Representatives. So Pennsylvania is a pretty big state, actually. We have 20. I think it's like we're like tied for 5th or something, or I think we're like 5th. Yeah, tied with Illinois for 5th place. So Pennsylvania is a big deal. Every state has a different number of electoral votes. Now, they change depending on population. They change. We do a census every 10 years, and so the electoral numbers do change. And let's do this. Let's 1876 electoral map. Let's see what we come up with. Okay, right there. So, well, that doesn't give us the totals, does it? Okay, here's Wikipedia. So can't really see much. Red is Hayes, who would go on to win, and blue is Tilden. And you see, Tilden won if you look at just the area of the map, a good portion of the country voted for Tilden, right, within their state. The popular vote, Tilden won 51% of the popular vote. Popular meaning just counting the votes, everybody. Now, that's not how you get elected, but sometimes we care about that. 51% to Hayes's 48%. So more Americans voted for Tilden, right? But when you look at how the Electoral College numbers play out, it's it's closer. I think that says Tilden in the red 185, or I'm sorry, Tilden in the blue 184, Hayes 185. So super close. They didn't know, as our reading says, it was unclear of the three states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina were disputed. So they must have had very close votes in their states, just like we saw this year. We did recounts. Back then they maybe do a recount, but it's very different. It's very slow. It's, the 1800s, so life is a little bit slower and different. So for almost 4 months into late November, they didn't know, or late February, they didn't know who had won the election. Tensions remained high. As always, you have Democrats and Republicans, and you better believe they both want to win that election, right? Elena, could you read paragraph 2 for us?
Okay. In January 77, Congress established a 15 members electoral commission to resolve the issue of which candidate had won the contested states. The commission voted 8-7 along party lines to award the votes of the three states to Hayes. As the commission deliberated, members of Congress and others made their own efforts to end the crisis, but no written formal agreements resulted.
Okay, thank you. So Congress in Washington, D.C. establishes a 15-member electoral commission. They say, okay, we got this problem. Somebody needs to look into this. Somebody needs to solve this. We're going to make this electoral commission, a special group, a committee, a commission who's going to go look at this, figure it out, talk to people, investigate, make a decision. They voted 8-7 along party lines. What does it mean along party lines? You hear that in the news anytime you're talking about Congress, the Senate, the House of Representatives. You hear sometimes a vote is along party lines.
Just on one party.
Yeah, the parties
because-
stick together, right?
Yes.
All the Democrats vote this way, all the Republicans vote that way. So 8-7. It's a 15-member commission. I'm guessing there were 8. Well, Hayes was a Republican, right? I'm guessing there was 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. Because it says it was along party lines. It would have been nice if they had all agreed, but they didn't agree. And the disagreement was straight up between the two parties. Well, that never looks real good, right? Even when it happens today, it's not very satisfying. It doesn't leave you with a feeling of that's the right answer. Like why does it have to be everybody from one party views something this way, every single person from the other party views it opposite? That's always a little suspicious. So that's good. I mean, maybe that's, Congress answering the problem, but it doesn't actually, it kind of creates more problems than it solves. Okay. The commission deliberated, members of Congress and others made their own efforts to end the crisis. The presidency in return for home rule in the South. So that was in January. I don't know when the commission gave its answer, but the problem is continuing here. Rana, do you want to read paragraph 3?
Sure. During Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, when the South reorganized its political, social, and economic systems to account for the end of slavery, federal troops occupied the South. These troops served to guarantee African American men's right to vote and the Republican-controlled federal government. would only end the military occupations when states rewrote their constitutions to recognize the citizenships and voting rights of African American men. White Southerners generally despised these troops and wanted an end to the intervention of the federal government in the South.
Okay, thank you. So we're talking federal troops. The federal troops would be the Army, the American Army. Federal always means like the central national government, right? So Washington, D.C. So if we talk about federal troops being in the South, that's the American Army, which just a few years before was the Union Army that the people of the South fought against. So for federal troops to be in the South, keeping the peace, guaranteeing that, that on voting day, African American former slaves can now vote. Um, to have them there is an offense to the people of the South, right? To the white people of the South. This is an old, cartoon that's probably showed up in a newspaper somewhere or something. Behind this sign behind the troop says Office of Marshal of U.S. Marshal. Here there's a white guy with a gun, it looks like, and a whip, and he's threatening, I don't know, is that a younger black person? I don't know. And maybe we could see what these signs say. The one says KKK. Okay, the Ku Klux Klan started during this period of the Reconstruction. So those federal troops, those American Army troops, were in the South. And in this picture, the troop is keeping them separate, right? He's got his gun with a bayonet, keeping them separated. They're there to protect the former slaves, the African Americans. They're there to get them to vote on voting day and when needed. So the South wants them out. The Compromise of 1877, it says, gave white Southerners their chance to stop the military occupation of the South. In the compromise, Southern Democrats agreed not to block the vote by which Congress awarded the contested electoral votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, and Hayes therefore became president. Okay, so this commission came up with its answer, said that, okay, we believe that Rutherford B. Hayes won those 3 states in the South and, and should be president. The Southern Democrats in Congress, if they wanted to, they could block that vote so that he doesn't become president. But they said, okay, we'll let him become president. We'll let that vote happen. It says, in return, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from actively intervening in the politics of Louisiana and South Carolina, the last 2 states occupied by federal troops. Accordingly, within 2 months of becoming president, Hayes ordered federal troops in Louisiana and South Carolina to return to their bases. So that is the compromise of 1877. This is the end of Reconstruction. That's it. It's not very complex. There's not a lot of parts. There was a contested, confusing election. They didn't know who won. So Congress steps in and decides who won. And the Southern Democrats in Congress allow Hayes to become president, allow anybody to become president, because both people were from the North, allow the presidency to proceed in return for that president then getting the federal troops out of the South. Okay. If you're a freed black man or woman in the South, that's not good news, right? Those federal troops, those army troops that are keeping you safe, that are enforcing your whatever civil rights you have back then, they're about to leave. And it's just going to be you and the white Southerners that used to be slave owners in the South. So, you'd be pretty worried. Okay, here's another cartoon. Thomas Nast was a famous cartoonist. A lot of these old, especially Civil War era cartoons, it's not really, we don't think of them as cartoons, but political cartoons we'd call them today. A lot of them were drawn by this artist Thomas Nast, and I think he was from the North. He was always very sympathetic for the North, for the Union in the Civil War, and they are political cartoons. They're not meant to be funny. They're meant to say a message. So let's look at this. So it says compromise with the South. And there's always a ton of details in a Thomas Nast cartoon. Some things are labeled. Okay, here we have North written on the bottom, South written on the bottom. There's always a ton of details and everything has symbolism. Well, okay, so in the middle we see um, somebody we would probably back then you'd recognize as a Southerner, standing tall, holding a sword, has his gun, standing tall, real confident, clean looking good, shaking hands with a northern, probably recognize him as a northern soldier holding a northern Union Army cap. Well, he's on crutches, missing a leg, head bowed. Clearly, between these two men, you can tell who is happy about the situation, right? Who has the power in this situation. The woman on the north side is crying. In the background of the north, you have a wall, a broken down wall, a house burning. The American flag is hung upside down, you notice, which is generally a sign of distress. Like if you're out at sea, if a sailing ship is flying their flag upside down, that means they need help. I think also sometimes in war, the winning side makes the losing side hang their flag upside down. So that's a sign of disgrace. Okay. Um, the I think this is the South. Is that the old South Carolina flag? I don't know. I don't know exactly what flag that is, but we have that flag hanging, also beaten up in tatters. There's writing on it we can't quite make out. This is an African American family. Looks, I think there's chains there, but they're praying, looking scared, looking worried. Okay. Now they're shaking hands over a grave that says, "In memory." What does it say? "In memory of the Union heroes." Something something. Oh, the caption says, "In memory of Union heroes in a useless war." So Thomas Nast is a Northerner. We can say, didn't like this compromise of 1877. Now, this is good because this kind of thing could show up on that GED test, on the high set social studies test, the GED social studies test. They give you a cartoon and they maybe give you a little bit of information with it, but you need to be able to look at this and say, okay, what is the meaning here? The meaning is this artist who drew this cartoon, who made it, does not like the compromise of 1877. He views it as a betrayal of the North, a betrayal of African Americans in the South, right? These people look worried, they look scared. We're giving a victory to the South. Look how tall and happy this guy looks. He calls it a useless war, saying, well, what was the point in fighting the Civil War if this is what we're going to do? If we're not going to, we free the slaves, but then we're not going to protect them in any way. So the person who drew this, and it shows up in newspapers, is critical of the compromise of 1877, right? Views it as a betrayal, a bad thing, a sad thing. Jendaya, could you read paragraph 5 for us?
The removal of the federal soldiers from the streets and from state house offices signaled the end of the Republican Party's commitment to protecting the civil and political rights of African Americans and marked a major political turning point in American history. It concluded Reconstruction.
Yeah, it ends the Reconstruction. It was viewed at the time, certainly this artist would view it as a betrayal, an end of the Republican Party's commitment to protecting the civil and political rights of African Americans in the South. You're turning your back on the people of the South. You're just letting them do the best they can. I don't know, living in the South with all those angry white Southerners who just got their butts kicked in the Civil War. You're turning your back, they would say at the time, and they did say, we are turning our back on the blacks in the South. So it says another important part of the Compromise of 1877 was that Republicans agreed to home rule in the South. Home rule meant that the Republican Party would refrain from interfering in the South's local affairs, and that white Democrats, many of them racist, would rule. Southern Democrats, for their part, pledged that they would recognize the civil and political equality of blacks. They did not subsequently carry through on this promise, but instead disenfranchised black men from voting and imposed Jim Crow segregation across the South. So, as part of this, we are going to remove the federal troops from the South, enforcing civil rights, protecting African American former slaves as they just try to get on their feet in life. And the South will do its own thing. Whoever wins elections in the South for like governor of Louisiana or, local governments in the South, the North, the Republican Party will not be involved. We will let you do things on your own in the South, however you see fit. Which, okay, that's always good that people are in charge of their own homes, right? But not if, frankly, not if they can't be trusted to do the right thing, maybe. So, again, this is viewed as a turning your back on the former slaves, the newly freed men of the South. Monique, could you read paragraph 7, the end of Reconstruction?
In all, with the Compromise of 1877, the Republican Party abandoned the last remnant of its support for equal rights for African Americans in the South. With the withdrawal of federal troops, went away hope of reconstructing the South as radically.
Racially
Oh,
egalitarian.
sorry, I don't have my glasses on. Racially, say that word again.
Egalitarian. It's another. I don't know if it's a different root word. It's like equality. It's kind of the same thing as. Well, I don't
South
know what.
as racially
Yeah,
egalitarian society.
egalitarian. Yes.
Black Louisiana lamented. The whole South, every state in the South, had got into the hands of the very men that held us as slaves.
Yeah. Okay. So, as somebody says, the whole South has got into the hands of the very men as held as slaves. They were slave owner, not all, but a good portion of Southern whites were slave owners. Even if you didn't own slaves, you could have still been sympathetic to slavery. Still could have liked it as a good thing for your economy, for your home, whatever. And now they're in charge, right? As much power as African Americans got very quickly after the Civil War with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment that gave them freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote. That was very fragile, right? Obviously, very, very fragile. And here we're just tossing them back into the South and saying, "Here, do the best you can. We're not gonna help you out anymore." Oluwakimi, could you read paragraph 8?
In the aftermath of Compromise of 1877, a few African Americans in some areas of the South continued to vote and serve in government offices into the 1890s. But the Compromise of 1877 marked the effective end of the Republican Party's active support of civil rights for Black Americans. Southern states rapidly passed laws disenfranchising This emphasize, excuse me, disenfranchising African Americans and implementing racial segregation.
Okay, so I tried to find a good short little other reading that we could tag onto this, talking about the segregation going forward, that we then see into the 1950s, 1960s. But I couldn't find quite the right reading. So let's talk about that for a minute. So because of the Compromise of 1877, which remember there was a contested election, Rutherford B. Hayes wins in return for getting the troops out. Because of those troops leaving, the South then gets to run its own show. And you have, it'd be interesting to know the details of exactly the numbers of voting white people versus voting black people and how that played out, and looking at specific elections and things like that. But the very fragile power that African Americans had in the South is really in danger. And the South and the racist whites in the South, which weren't all, but the racist whites in the South, get their power back. And again, the Ku Klux Klan is coming up at this time, which is basically a terrorist organization that was meant to scare those African Americans back into like a lower place in society, scare them back into submission. Don't let them get the power politically, economically, socially that they are entitled to, obviously, and constitutionally allowed, right? They're allowed to vote. And if in a given town, if however your town votes, if it's white or black or whatever, a mix, whatever, that election should be the way it is. But the Ku Klux Klan and other groups used terror tactics, right? Killing people, attacking people, to scare African Americans into submission. Now, the Ku Klux Klan is real big during this time, especially kind of flames up right here at the end of Reconstruction, and then they get tamped down, kind of disappears for a while. It then rages back up in the 1900s, the 1910s, 1920s. The KKK comes back with a vengeance, but still the same type of things. Their goal is to terrorize and scare
I'm doing well, thank
scare
you.
black people into fear and submission. Okay, so it says Southern states rapidly pass laws disenfranchising African Americans. What is disenfranchisement? That's a good social studies word. You really only hear
Yes,
about that.
I used your website link.
So what is disenfranchisement?
Like taking away, how do I do it?
I didn't hear taking away what?
I'm trying to see how I can put it.
Isn't it that it's just like being deprived?
No, it's a specific. You're taking away something specific.
Your privilege.
Taking away control.
Right?
No.
No.
Like the right to vote.
The right to vote. I don't know why this word means that, but disenfranchise means to take away somebody's right to vote or their ability to vote, right? Or to make voting harder. You can make it illegal for,
This word is specifically just the right to vote.
It is. I don't know why. I don't know where we get this
Because
word.
when you think of disenfranchisement, you think you could do that to anybody by just taking the rights of privilege away. But okay,
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I'm pretty sure disenfranchised. I mean, maybe it can mean something more general, but 99 times out of 100, it means specifically the right to vote, okay, or the ability, or the
I didn't know that.
the ease of voting. So Southern states pass laws. Now, some of those are Now they can't make it illegal, right? It has to stay
Follow
because
the
it's in the
law.
Constitution. So during that time, now after 1877 into the 1940s, 1950s, it's not illegal for black people to vote, but it becomes very hard for black people to vote, right?
Right, because they did things to purposely stop them from voting.
Right, like you have to have, they would, in a town or a state or a county, they'd pass literacy laws. You have to be literate. You have to come and show up at the polling place and read this paragraph, which is unconstitutional.
And they made, yeah, I read something somewhere and I can't remember where I read it, but they would make them read ridiculous words.
Right, yeah.
Just
Yeah.
like a whole sentence of ridiculous words, like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. And whoever judging them on the other end of the table, oh, you can't read it, you can't vote. It was
Right.
that ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was even grandfather, you've heard maybe the term grandfather clause. If your grandfather was a slave, I think there's some places had laws where like if your parents or grandparents were slaves, you can't vote. So like that's not based on your race, it's just based on if your grandparents were slaves. Well, obviously that is based on race. So
Right,
I
right.
mean, states and towns and counties came up with all kinds of crazy and unfair rules to
And didn't
keep
that
black
leak
people
to
from
the
voting.
north? I mean, didn't segregation leak its way into the north as well?
Yes. Okay. So we're talking about disenfranchising African Americans and implementing racial segregation. Segregation is, let's get a good picture going here.
Because I remember going to school and I went to a very older school. The building was old. And on one side of the building, it said girls. On the other side of the building, it said boys. And when you would go down into the basement cellar, we had our first floor. It was like the art section and things like that. We had bathrooms down there and one above the doors. And then, I mean, written in concrete so that it was like casted in the stone. In the bathrooms, it said blacks on one side and it said whites on the other.
Really?
We,
Wow.
yes. And that's how old the school was. Now,
Yeah.
they had put pictures over them,
Huh.
but until they had remade the school, had they actually tore the school down at one point and rebuilt it. But I remember I actually was in fourth grade and I asked my teacher, what does that mean? She said, don't you worry about none of that. And she kept
Yeah.
the whole class going. But we didn't talk about that little in school, you know.
Mhm.
So, but I do remember that very vividly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, and segregation was in the North. I don't know exactly the extent of things, but here's a famous picture of different water fountains for, this like this sign, you can't quite say it. It says white women, colored women. Well, I guess that's women and men
Right.
bathrooms, but different water fountains because what? Like different people have different germs, or whatever. But
Yeah.
you know,
Catch people.
different the famous, Rosa Parks on a bus. Black people have to sit in a different place on the bus or on a train. Hotels, you couldn't just show up at a hotel if you were African Americans. There was a lot of things you couldn't do, right? That
Yeah,
is
there's a movie. It's called The Green
segregation.
Book.
Yeah, I've never
And
seen that movie, but yeah.
it's very good. I recommend everybody watch it, but you'll learn about what the Green Book actually was.
Hmm.
It was a navigational tool for Black African Americans where they could stay, where they could eat. It was like a guide. And if you
Yeah,
have,
and it was like
yeah, and if any
published.
of you
Yeah.
get to a chance to watch the movie, just sit down and enjoy it with your family. Your whole family can watch it. There's nothing bad in it for children of an appropriate age, but it's a really good movie, and I suggest everyone watch it.
Yeah.
You'll learn a lot, believe it or not.
Yeah. So
What
this,
do you say? Can you write the title out, please?
What?
yeah, Green Book.
What do
We'll
you
put
say
it.
the
Green
title
Book.
is?
I'm sorry, I should not have done that. Now we're all talking about movies.
That's all right.
I'm sorry.
No, it's
All
okay.
right, I put it
It's
in the
really,
chat.
really good.
Yeah. So yeah, that all started. Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know if you'd say it all started, but
Well,
it was
continued.
a big part of it. We continued from the 1877, the Compromise of 1877, where the federal troops were removed from the South, and then the South could do whatever they wanted. And of course, there was lots of conflict, but who's at that point, who's in a better position to win this political battle?
Now, is it fair to say that the Republicans were the less party and the Democrats had majority rule in 1877? Because by the last paragraph in which I read, it says that it had ended, that the compromise essentially ended the Republicans' support of civil rights for Black Americans.
Mhm.
So is it to say that the Democrats at that time had more control?
Well, they did in the South. Like if you look, most of the South and these three states that are red are Republican in the South in 1876. They were contested. So like we don't, we can't today. We're not really sure what
How?
majority they were. The South into the 1900s, not so much the 1800s. We call like there's a historical period where we call the Southern Democrats the Dixiecrats, like
Okay.
Dixie, the
Right.
land of Dixie being the South. So we call them Dixiecrats. Now I don't know historically exactly what Dixiecrat refers to, but the Democrats in the South were a big thing. Now, of course, Democrats then are hold different views somewhat than Democrats today. Republicans then may hold different views than Republicans today. The parties evolve over time. So just if you're a Democrat or Republican today, you may or may not be in full agreement with that party back then.
Right.
But so I don't really know like the views, the beliefs of the Democrats back then, the Republicans back then. But I think the Democrats held the majority in the South strong enough that it was tough for them to win the next election. Let's look at the next election, 1880. So there you go. The
Okay.
Democrats
Yeah.
win the entire South. So
Okay.
that's Garfield versus Hancock. But that tells you right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a little bit better. No, what's that? That's 1884. Yeah, the Republicans, the whole North is Republican, the whole South plus a little bit is Democrats. Now, even though you still have the Electoral College going to the Republican
Right.
because there's so many people that live in the North. The big cities are all in the North: Chicago,
Right.
New
That's
York.
where the advantage was.
Right. So, but yeah, I mean that the next election right there tells you everything you need to know. Plus, there's the next one, 1884. You know, the Democrats. There's plenty of Republicans in the South, but the South is majority and strong majority Democrat. So when those Republicans kind of walk away from the black people in the South, they're then in the hands of the Democrats.
But that was the compromise.
That was I mean, if they hadn't, if the people of the North had said, no, we're not going to take troops out of the South, no way.
Right.
Then you would have, I mean, I don't know exactly what happens if there's a true question about who won the election. I don't. The Constitution does have a plan for that. I don't know what it is, but it would have been messy. Then you have, they're just 10 years out of the Civil War. Then maybe the South would say, hey, we don't like the outcome of that election. We don't believe that election. We're going to secede again and do another
Right.
war.
And everything just continued. Right.
It was a dicey. So the people in the North said, hey, we don't want
Really,
that.
either way you went, it was catch 2020.
Yeah, you're in trouble either way. Yeah, for sure.
Right.
So that's the Reconstruction period, the Reconstruction era, and That's why in every history book, the Reconstruction era, they say is 1865 to 1877. That's the end of Reconstruction.
Yeah. Okay.
So any questions about anything?
No.
No,
No.
good job.
No.
Thank you.
Anybody? Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, next week we've been talking about the Civil War for a good long time, so I'm gonna try to find something totally different, maybe a little bit lighter and happier.
I think we
Well,
learned. I think we learned a lot about the Civil War. I was
yeah,
saying, I was saying that saying last week, the Civil War is basically about slavery, and we have to also know who was slavery, who was a part of slavery, who were slaves. We got to learn about former slaves and who abolished slavery, like
mhm,
Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman,
yeah,
and Harriet Tubman. Why you say that? Well, because that's who we gotta learn about those people, the lives that they live. The
mhm.
next, the next, the next thing we gotta do is just learn who was in the Civil War. That's all.
Yeah. I mean, we could study, and people do. We could study this for the rest of our lives. Um, but I mean, as I said at the beginning, the goal is to just cover the broad things, understand the basic story of America. And I think, as we've talked about before, people don't know the Reconstruction happened, certainly don't know how it ended. If you walk down the street and ask 1,000 people what the Compromise of 1877 was, I don't think you'll get anybody who knows it. But it's a part of the story. It's a part of the
Right.
trajectory, the story of America. So,
Mm.
so I'll send out this reading, and I'll send out um, this recording, and Ron, I'll link to my whole playlist. I put this video on YouTube, and then I put it as part of a playlist. And if you want to go back and I have the topic right there. If you want to
Uh-huh.
look at something, you're welcome to.
Well,
But
yeah, I mean, this recording is fun.
yeah,
I'm
yeah, you're
just,
focusing on reading stuff, so
yes, reading.
that's good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining everybody, Rana. Thank you, and
Okay, and thank you.
yeah,
Thank you,
everybody
guys.
have a great day.
Yeah.
I
You
was
too. Bye-bye.
I was also talking to my mother and father about this, and she said that we also learn about our ancestors. I learned that